I have to tell you that on September 1st, 1939, my aunt, whose name I bear, was asked to strip down naked when the Nazis marched into Poland and to throw her two infant twin daughters down, who were mowed down. And she was asked to jump into a pit where she was mowed down, together with her entire community of Borschtów, Poland. In 2000, why did this happen? It happened because she was a Jew. In 2002, the journalist Daniel Pearl in Pakistan was asked to kneel down. Before he was decapitated, they had him admit, "I am a Jew." Why was he mowed down? Because he was a Jew. A few weeks ago, on June 12, 2014, Iya Yafrach, Gilad Shaer, and Naftali Frankel were kidnapped and brutally murdered on their way home from school. Why? Because they were Jews. Within the last several weeks, Hamas has launched more than 400 Qassam rocket missiles into Israel. Why? Because it is the Jewish state. In 2004, Natan Sharansky penned a seminal essay for the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, where he spoke of the old anti-Semitism versus the new anti-Semitism. The old anti-Semitism he defined against Jewish people and the Jewish religion. The new anti-Semitism is against the collective state of the Jews, Israel. Today, we see that the new anti-Semitism is alive and well and is metastasizing like a virulent cancer throughout college campuses and, of course, in our institutions of universal jurisdiction, such as the United Nations, that most of us spoke about today. In 2013, there were 21 separate resolutions condemning the state of Israel in the General Assembly, and just four, in the rest of the world, including North Korea, which is like one great big concentration camp, Syria, where there's been a massacre of 150,000 Muslims in their internecine civil war, and the Congo, in which thousands of people were killed in that year, and over a million in the last decade. In the midst of the Muslim and Arab world, which has been imploding all around the tiny little Jewish state, we have one teeny tiny stable democracy where human rights and the rule of law is paramount. It's the place where Arabs and Muslims are elected to the Knesset and are free to openly criticize the government, and where hospitals and waiting rooms are full of Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and where their hospitals on the northern border with Syria are treating hundreds of patients of the war wounded in the brutal internecine Syrian civil war. Why is it that Israel is so reviled? In what Ambassador Ron Dermer called a reversal of causality, which I've always called an Orwellian version of history, people will claim that Israel is reviled because of the occupation. That, my friends, is a grand deception that flies in the face of the facts. Ever since 1939, the Pale Commission's report, there was a recommendation of two states living side by side, one Arab, one Jewish. Again, this happened on November 29th, 1947, with the United Nations Partition Plan. Then, after the War of June 1967, the Defensive War, which Israel was forced to fight and was victorious, Israel had the idea of going to the conference in Khartoum in the Sudan, and they asked for land for peace. The response was the famous three no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. Something happened in 1987. That was the first intifada. And it was very, very difficult for Israeli Jews, whose military policy had always been based on the conception of tahor neshek, on the purity of arms, to be confronted with the visage of Palestinian Rus throwing stones at them. That's when something went a bit soft, and many Israelis looked inward and blamed themselves for the occupation. My personal theory about this is it has something to do with the Jewish theology and Jewish philosophy, where every single Yom Kippur, one of our holiest days, we pound our breasts and we beat ourselves collectively for the sins of anyone else. And we think, if only we tried a little bit harder, if only we just gave back a little bit more, then they would finally love us and accept our right to exist. Partly because of this, two academics, Uri Severa and Ron Pondek, came up with the concept of the Oslo Accords. And this was actually conceived of behind closed doors in Oslo, Sweden, and then Yitzhak Rabin came reluctantly along to it. Oslo, Oslo II, Hebron Y, and all the subsequent accords have always been predicated on one fundamental premise, and that is Israel would give something very tangible and something real, land, in exchange for an end of incitement and an end for terror. Israel would give up something very real in exchange for the promise of peace. Yet, not a day goes by when you and I do not get an alert from Palestinian Media Watch or Memory, two wonderful organizations, about the constant and steady diet of incitement to hate and to kill the Israeli and the Jew coming directly from the top of the Palestinian Authority. I have to tell you, I was in Israel in June of 2005, right before the Israelis decided to give up Gaza. They gave up Gaza in the absence of a negotiating partner, and my friends at the left were telling me, we will finally prove to the world just how far and how willing Israel is to go for the sake of peace, even if they don't want to accept us. I remember very clearly how deeply divisive that debate was. Israeli soldiers were taught not to feel the pain when they would remove residents from Gaza from their homes. I remember that millionaires were saying, we will give the money to the people living in Gaza, the Palestinians there, to buy the greenhouses and to give it to them. Israeli rabbis were saying, let's leave the synagogues. These synagogues should be turned into mosques. After all, we all pray to the same God. Well, I have to tell you that as soon as the last Israeli soldier turned the key and locked the gate and left, and as soon as that blue and white flag was lowered, those greenhouses and those synagogues were destroyed. And everything that Israel left was destroyed in what can only be described as a nihilistic carnival of hatred. And Israel, in return, has gotten at least 10,000 Qassam rocket missiles into its southern region. And this is what it is fighting today. Again, I have to say, the offer was made at Camp David on July 25th, 2000. I was there in the audience when Eliakim in the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, When Eliakim Rubinstein, who was the Attorney General for the State of Israel at the time, came in to address the group, and he said to us, I could look every one of you in the eye, and I could tell you that we went as far as any responsible Israeli government could possibly go. We are offering them all of Gaza, because Israel still had Gaza, all of Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, if you will, with a tiny little corridor around Jerusalem that they were going to keep. In exchange for that, they were going to give up some of the Negev, and shared sovereignty of Jerusalem, Israel's and Jews' one holiest city, and a right of return of thousands and thousands of Palestinian refugees. And he was stunned, and he said, there are people who are crying on the way back to Ronald Reagan Airport today in their limousines because Arafat didn't say yes and he didn't say no. He simply walked away from the table. And the response came a few months later in the form of a second intifada. Again in 2008, Ehud Omar went even further, and when he was negotiating with Abu Mazen, and he wanted to offer sovereignty of the Temple Mount to Abu Mazen. And then, of course, this past May, the peace talks broke down with Abu Mazen when he could not get out of his throat without the gag effect, a response of accepting Israel's right to live as a Jewish state. Part of the problem, I have to say, is that when Arafat walked away from the negotiating table and the bar was set so high, it would be very, very, very hard for any interlocutor who was representing the Palestinians to accept less. And after all these years and years of terrorism, it was very, very hard for any Israeli interlocutor to offer up quite as much. Now, telling the truth about Israel has gotten very, very, very difficult, and I'm going to try to hurry up because I know that you're all hungry. But as you can see, the simple reason is that the Arabs simply refuse to recognize the right of the Jewish people to come back to their historic homeland, irrespective of how generous the size, the shape, and the contours of the borders of Israel and Palestine might be. Why is this? The same reason why my aunt was asked to strip down naked and mowed down by the Nazis. The same reason why Daniel Pearl was abducted and was beheaded in 2002. And the same reason why Naftali Ayal and Gilad were kidnapped and murdered on June 12th. And the same reason why more than 400 missiles have been lobbed into the Jewish state within the past several weeks. Because they are Jews. Telling the truth about Israel means telling the truth about anti-Semitism. A recent poll that was conducted by the ADL, which consisted of 53,100 interviews in 100 countries, said the strongest anti-Semitic attitudes of any population polled is in the Palestinian territories. And another poll, which you should all know about, that was recently conducted by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, has indicated that only 27.3% of Palestinians want a two-state solution. By contrast, more than 2/3 see the restoration of all of historic Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea as their ultimate goal. What they want to do with the 6 million Jews that are currently inhabiting the Jewish state of Israel, one only shudders to thinking about the over 200,000 Sunnis and Shiites that have been killed in Syria. So, my friends, this is not a territorial dispute. This is an existential struggle for the Jewish state's right to exist. It has always been, and it always will be. And the sooner the United States and other countries around the world realize this, the better. And at the core of this is a familiar old sentiment, a virus that seems to be immutable to time or place or any rational antidote, anti-Semitism. Thank you very much.